don't know, that may help the meeting. Good morning, everybody, and Happy New Year to all. Today is Wednesday, January 8th, 2025. I'm Eric Blank, and this is the Commissioners' weekly meeting. And maybe to start the New Year's off, we'll start with you, Commissioner Goman. Any opening remarks? Are you ready to approve the consent agenda?
Nothing. Hi, everyone. Good to see you. I would vote to approve the consent agenda.
Commissioner Plant.
Happy New Year. I would approve the consent agenda as well.
As would I. Proceeding number 23A-0633G, the Black Hills, Colorado Clean Heat Plan exceptions. Mr. Mendelson, Ms. Dundas.
Good morning, Commissioners. I'm Mike Mendelson of your advisory team. I'm joined by Ms. Dundas of Commission Counsel.
I'm not sure that's true, Mr. Mendelson.
I hope that's true.
Imaginary friends, imaginary counsel.
Right. Black Hills Gas filed its 2024 to 2028 Clean Heat Plan on December 29, 2023, and in accordance with Section 40-3.2-108 CRS and Commission Rule 4729D. Parties to the case include trial staff, UCA, CEOs, and SWEEP. All parties but SWEEP entered into a comprehensive settlement agreement, which was approved by ALJ Hahn. The settlement closely matches the company's direct filing preferred case. I'll focus primarily on the settlement and SWEEP's contention with it. The settlement approves $18.37 million for the shortened 3-year period, 2025 to 2027, climbing each year from an annual value of $5.4 million in 2025 to nearly $7 million in 2027. 72% of the total investment, or $13.24 million, is allocated to DSM. Of that total, 20%, or $2.65 million, is set aside for the IQ community. Of the remaining funds, $3.5 million is allocated to advanced monitoring and leak detection, or AMLD. $1 million is allocated to the purchase of renewable natural gas, also known as recovered methane, and $100,000 is allocated to the procurement of beneficial electrification for the Rocky Ford pilot project. Notably, Black Hills serves over 200,000 gas customers via a dispersed non-continuous service territory across the state. Its gas territory overlaps with its electric territory for only 2,000 customers in the Rocky Ford area. Hence, the Rocky Ford project is limited to those specific customers. The company notes in its direct case that it overlaps with 23 different electric service providers, mostly municipal or cooperative entities, and is not allowed to compete with any of them. They also suggest coordination across 23 different electric service providers, particularly the unregulated entities, would be very challenging, that it would be very difficult to validate emission reductions or facilitate a fair cost recovery. The company also argued in its direct case that forced electrification, as they refer to a broader BE program, is not in the best interest of its customers. Finally, of the settlement budget values, $450,000 is set aside for a feasibility study for the development of a thermal pipeline system, and another $100,000 is set aside for DI community engagement and outreach. The overall budget of $18 million was adopted in the settlement because it represents, over a 3-year period, a 2.5% increase in rates. That value, representing a retail cost cap, is referenced in statute and commission rules, where the commission may require the company to spend a higher amount if 4 criteria are met. The overall expenditure level, as well as emission reduction benefits as such, is one of SWEEP's primary arguments in opposing the settlement, which I'll discuss below. The retail cost cap is based on a 5-year average of actual company revenues and assumed growth rate of 2% per year. The settling parties agreed to a shortened CHP timeframe of 25 to 27 rather than the initial proposal, which would have been in place through 2028. Instead, the company will file a combined DSM and CHP application in 27, which will cover the 28 to 32 period. The settlement will also allows budget flexibility of up to 15% within and between clean heat resources, which must be preceded by a 60-day notice process. The settling parties agreed that the company will recover CHP costs through the inaugural Clean Heat Plan rider, which will be set annually on a forecasted basis and will be subject to an annual true-up filed by advice letter each April to ensure the rider effect reflects the actual costs incurred. The DSM investment leverages the company's current efficiency programs, but the company retains discretion to introduce new DSM program concepts through the 60-90-day notice process during the course of the CHP. The settling parties agree that Black Hills will use its CHP to facilitate greater enrollment in its gas energy assistance program for eligible income qualified participants via automatic enrollment. The settlement further allows the company to use its DSM IQ program budget to cover the cost of the affordability benefit if the associated surcharge is at the maximum permitted level. If Black Hills successfully contracts for RNG, the settling parties agree that only the incremental cost of RNG is recoverable in the CHP rider, while commodity costs are recoverable via the gas cost adjustment. The settlement directs that if the company is unable to enter into a contract for RNG resources by March 31, 2027, the associated funds will be reallocated to the CHP DSM budget. The settlement states that no performance incentive mechanism or PIM will be offered to the company. With respect to the thermal pilot program, the settling parties agree that this feasibility study should include siting analysis of potential locations, including consideration of the potential direct and indirect economic benefits to the company, its customers, and direct end users, avoided fuel and gas infrastructure costs, and impacts to each of the sites proposed from the development of the project in those communities. The settlement also places guidelines to the 60-90-day notice process if the company wishes to modify any aspect of its plan, requires annual reporting, and makes specific requirements on the company's next CHP filing, including to explain specifically how building energy codes and standards impacts its forecasts, include thermal energy networks in its portfolio modeling, and clearly identify how cost-effectiveness analysis complies with relevant commission rules. SWEEP objected to the settlement, proposed far higher spending levels, proposed its own portfolio that included significant levels of BE that it contends is consistent with the Commission's ruling in Public Services CHP application, proceeding number 22A0392EG. SWEEP also suggested that the cost cap be based only on a single year's revenues and took issue with the settlement's emphasis on recovered methane resources. The recommended decision by ALJ Hahn made several specific findings in addition to approving the settlement agreement in full. That the budget SWEEP proposes far exceeds what can reasonably be imposed on the company's customers. Specifically, it found that the benefits of SWEEP's proposed emissions reductions do not outweigh the comparatively exorbitant costs that would be imposed on BHCG's customers. The recommended decision also rejected SWEEP's suggestion that the cost cap be calculated based on only 1 year's revenue, finding that using an average of 5 years' revenue to calculate the cost cap protects against arriving at too high a cost cap based on an uncharacteristically high revenue year. The ALJ was not persuaded to exceed the cost cap simply because the Commission approved the budget in excess of the cost in Public Services CHP. It finds, in contrast, BHCG's customers, who are all gas customers, will not be spared the expense of paying for other customers' BE because, unlike Public Service, BHCG has no electric customers who can pick up the cost of the BE. Instead, the full cost of any BE will be borne by BHCG's gas customers. The ALJ also found that the settlement portfolio to be reasonable and appropriate. The CHP proposed by the settling parties incorporates several of the alternative clean heat resources set out in Section 40-3.21082C. Indeed, all of the GHG reduction mechanisms upon which the settling parties CHP relies are recognized by the General Assembly as clean heat resources. SWEEP's proposal, on the other hand, focuses exclusively on the use of BE and DSM in enormous quantities to get BHCG closer to its clean heat targets. Putting all of BHCG's eggs into the BE and DSM basket is not without risk, though, the recommended decision found. Sweep's exceptions to the recommended decision include, they state, first, Black Hills Clean Heat Plan should reduce the company's greenhouse gas emissions compared to the 2015 baseline and decrease emissions even between 2025 and 2030. Yet Black Hills projects that under the settlement, it will emit more greenhouse gases in 2025 and 2030 than it did in 2015. Moreover, Black Hills projects that its emissions will increase over the next 5 years. Second, Black Hills has steadfastly refused to include any BE in this clean heat plan other than the limited Rocky Ford pilot that would apply to just 2,000 customers or less than 1% of its residential customers. The company claims that it is unable to offer BE because it is a gas-only utility. However, the Clean Heat Statute does not exempt gas-only utilities from beneficial electrification, and the record here shows that electrification, along with DSM, is the most cost-effective and readily available resource to reduce Black Hills greenhouse gas emissions. Electrification, they say, is a key pillar of Colorado's decarbonization strategy, and all Colorado gas utilities must implement electrification under the state strategy to decarbonize buildings. Third, according to SWEEP, the settlement agreement assigns an impermissibly large amount of the clean heat budget to two recovered methane resources, renewable natural gas and advanced monitoring and leak detection, or AMLD. Clean Heat Statute limits how much recovered methane utilities can include in a clean heat plan, and Black Hills plan exceeds these limits. In addition, RNG and AMLD are expensive resources that cost more per ton of emissions reduction than beneficial electrification and DSM. RNG also fails to provide several other benefits that BE and DSM provide. Despite those flaws, the recommended decision approved the settlement agreement in full. Most importantly, SWEEP objects to the fact that the settlement would not reduce emissions in a meaningful way or place Black Hills on track to meet the statute's 22% emission reduction by 2030. SWEEP proposes its own portfolio, which includes a total budget of $52.8 million. Of this value, $30.9 million is allocated to BE. SWEEP's budget places no funds to other resources included in the settlement, as such as AMLD or RNG. They project that its portfolio would result in roughly 85,000 megatons of CO2 equivalent reductions over the 3-year life of the plan. SWEEP suggests that while its portfolio will still almost certainly fall short of the 2030 clean heat target, it will result in over 80% more emissions reduction than the settlement agreement during the plan period and put the company on the right track. In its exception, SWEEP requests the Commission find it in the public interest to exceed the cost cap and increase the settlement agreement's clean heat plan budget and modify the portfolio of clean heat resources. Responses to SWEEP's exceptions include Black Hills' response, where they say that the recommended decision appropriately addresses the issues raised in this CHP. It also suggests that SWEEP's points upon exception are simply a rehash of areas fully litigated and addressed through written testimony, that the settlement fully complies with statute, and that the settlement strikes a fair and reasoned compromise by the parties in this proceeding. Specifically, Black Hills contends that the ALJ did not err in finding and concluding that SWEEP's proposed budget imposes too high a cost burden on Black Hills customers, and two, that the settlement portfolio of clean heat resources are reasonable and in the public interest. Black Hills argues that the settlement produces a more cost-effective plan, as SWEEP's proposal would triple the budget but only double the emissions reductions. The company contends it has a long history of successfully implementing energy efficiency programs through the company's DSM plan. However, DSM is not a limitless resource that can be almost doubled in a short period of time. They say, as described by Mr. Cottrell, the company's potential study explores the upper bound for both DSM spending and savings. BH argues that the budget flexibility approved in the settlement agreement is reasonable and in line with other commission-approved program terms. They also argue that there is no evidence to support the commission approving a clean heat plan with costs greater than the cost cap, and in particular, no evidence the sweeps plan would mitigate rate impacts for IQ customers. The company suggested in its direct case that its preferred plan, with the settlement generally mirrors, achieves 11% of the 2030 target. Notably, the company does not argue that emissions will still be above the 2015 baseline levels, or even that they will continue to grow through 2030. Based on figures presented, it appears emissions will stay approximately flat through the 2027 CHP period. With respect to recover methane, BH argues that SWEEP is incorrect, that the plan will result in more emission reductions than allowed by statute. They say they similarly contest SWEEP's assertion that DSM and BE are the most cost-effective resources for Black Hills. Finally, Black Hills further argues that not all tools are equally available to each and every utility. BE is not available to them because forced electrification would violate the takings clause, violate cost recovery principles. CEO also responded to SWEEP's exceptions and suggests the approved settlement agreement establishes a reasonable clean heat plan for Black Hills that reflects the circumstances of the utility, is in the public interest. The Commission should not modify the agreement. They also argue the Commission should maintain the portfolio of clean heat resources approved in the settlement agreement. CEO recognizes that for the inaugural CHP, which this is, it is appropriate to remain under the statutory cap. That is why they supported the settlement agreement. CEO also recognizes the difficulty that growth in Black Hills service territory presents to meeting the emissions targets, and is optimistic that by the next CHP filing, that the company will have developed a more cost-effective path towards meeting its 2030 target. CEO challenges SWEEP's interpretation of recovered methane statutory cap and argues that by using the CDPHE workbook, the company is actually in compliance with the recovered methane caps. They also argue retaining the thermal aspect of the settlement agreement is in the public interest. Staff did not file a response specifically to SWEEP's exceptions, but did support the settlement, and via its SOP, argued it represents a diverse interest and a reasonable compromise among the parties, establishes a regulatory path to consider DSM and CHP in a combined proceeding, applies guidance from the public service CHP while recognizing the differing circumstances surrounding Black Hills, and protects ratepayers, including IQ and DI communities, by limiting the budget to the statutory cost cap. UCA also did not file a response to SWEEP's exceptions, but in their SOP argued SWEEP's proposed portfolio relied too heavily on DSM and BE alone. Emission reductions associated with DSM and BE, they said, are ultimately dependent on customer adoption or customer action. With these resources, the utility can provide incentives to customers to remove barriers to energy efficiency. But as Mr. Brandt acknowledged, it is ultimately the customer who has to make the choice to electrify or use less gas. By contrast, the portfolio in the settlement contains both resources that depends on customer adoption, such as DSM, as well as resources the company can deploy without customer adoption, such as AMLT and RNG. Second, they say the budget contemplated in SWEEP CHP it far exceeds the statutory cost cap without meeting the statutory criteria necessary in order to exceed the cap. So the basic decision before you is whether to accept the settlement and recommend a decision, or alternatively, find the settlement is not in the public interest because, as SWEEP suggests, it does not adequately lower GHG emissions to meet state goals. It fails to require BE adoption in a meaningful manner, or C, it fails in another manner raised by SWEEP. By adopting the settlement, the Commission would be agreeing to the 2.5% retail cost cap, limiting BE to the small Rocky Ford community, adopting the other portfolio elements, including the AMLD and thermal pilot evaluation. If the Commission decides to reject the settlement or that it needs more time to review, I'll request that advisors have an additional week to evaluate and present the individual arguments more closely, and for the Commission to finalize its deliberations at next week's CWM. With that, I'll pause here for your discussion and can answer any questions.
Commissioner Gilman.
Thank you, Mr. Mendelson. Well, I hate to start us off on a really strong foot here, but I would say today I'm not prepared to either accept the settlement agreement or go with SWEEP's proposal. But I think it might be a good opportunity, you know, if you all agree with taking an extra week, as Mr. Mendelson indicated was possible, given the timeline here, to talk about a few kind of concerns or things that we could look into with regard to the settlement agreement, to understand if it's our best option to make any modifications there or accept it as is. So happy to go through a few of those kind of concerns or thoughts that I had. As we look in the settlement agreement, there's a pilot program for a thermal energy network or study, which gained a lot of support, but I might want to look with advisors and council this week as to if we should put some additional bounds around that in terms of stakeholder involvement to ensure that that study really reflects the most reasonable kind of assumptions and process to ensure that it really is valuable for the money being spent and the time being spent on that study to evaluate that as a real option, and ensuring that there's some robust stakeholder engagement there to ensure that we get to an outcome that was worth the time and money spent on the effort. Also, you know, there's not, kind of similar to other CHPs we've seen, not a lot of information within the filing itself with regard to specific rebates, but it's my understanding from some of the testimony that essentially the money would be used to augment existing rebates, basically in terms of DSM on their gas system. And I'd like to express some similar concerns as I've had, I think, with regard to like public services, DSM-SI, to the extent that Black Hills Gas will rely heavily on replacement of gas furnaces and boilers with condensing gas furnaces and boilers, or high efficiency gas furnaces and boilers, I think it's important that we look into ensuring that those are replacing less efficient or non-condensing furnaces or boilers. Given the timeline that those have been highly prevalent in the market, I think it's quite likely that you're replacing quite a few of the same at this point, which really brings into question a lot of the emissions math, and should we really be spending rebates to replace like with like at this point. So I think one thing that would be helpful to look into, to first of all ensure that we're being as cost effective as possible, but also that the greenhouse gas reduction math is actually right, is to look into limiting those rebates to the replacement of non-condensing equipment to ensure there actually is a greenhouse gas benefit to providing those rebates. I also think we could look into the availability of rebates for new construction for gas equipment. That's something, you know, at least in public services, DSM-SI, that we indicated should cease at this point, especially in Black Hills Gas territory. There's several electric utilities providing rebates for electrification for new construction. The extent to which we're providing rebates for gas equipment for new construction may well actually cannibalize efforts that could actually result in higher greenhouse gas reduction efforts. And so I think we need to be pretty thoughtful and precise in what is actually available with this clean heat funding, or what is this clean heat funding augmenting, to be sure that it actually looks like the most effective path to greenhouse gas reduction, to the extent that it competes with or cannibalizes other efforts that may actually be more effective in long-term reductions, and not kind of locking in the dependence on more gas usage. You know, that could be a concern with this in terms of, are we really moving in the right direction, or does some of this move us in the wrong direction? With regard to the RNG within their portfolio, I think they have $1 million for 1 year. We looked at a similar thing with public service. It's not clear. I mean, there is no actual project identified, so we don't understand the term of the project or a lot of the details. and what we did with Public Services Clean Heat Plan is to look at net present value on that to ensure that this is not interpreted as $1 million annually for unknown amount of time to be spent on RNG. So I think we might want to look at options there. Just the settlement agreement is not detailed enough about it to really understand what sort of commitment we might be making. And, as I understand it, any actual project would come to a 60, 90-day process, but I still think it's probably important for the commission to set an expectation of what is the total we expect to actually be spent on RNG under this plan, since it's only represented in 1 year as essentially an annual expense. With regard to AMLD, I think this is something else we could benefit from talking with advisors and counsel over the next week. As I understand the settlement agreement, the proposal is basically that the cost for the AMLD deployment be essentially booked as a clean heat expense and recovered in that way. But it's not at all clear that the emissions reductions would be clean heat resources. And so I'm worried if we have a mismatch there where we're tagging some money and pinning the cost recovery on clean heat, but it's not clear it's a resource. As we look at the statute, this is one of the only places that the statute makes the distinction that greenhouse gas reductions, specifically in the area of leak reduction, must be cost effective to be counted as a clean heat resource. So I think we need to kind of better understand, are we matched appropriately with how we're booking the money, and if we are actually getting a greenhouse gas reduction that could be considered a clean heat resource as a result of that spending. Not to say it's not a worthwhile endeavor, but do we have a mismatch as to where and how we're collecting that money, and if it actually is a clean heat resource. And then I think to some of Sweep's kind of broader points about if beneficial electrification should be included within the plan, certainly is a difficult foot to start on, essentially putting almost all our eggs in the DSM basket here. As some of Black Hill's own witnesses point out, it's somewhat unclear how deep the DSM resource really is, especially considering some of my prior points about, some of these rebates, some of these things might not be real greenhouse gas reductions at this point. And so I think it's important for us to look to the longevity of how are we building to longer term greenhouse gas reductions? Can we really get there kind of continuing to ignore BE as a resource, which we've determined elsewhere to be a highly cost-effective method to get there. And so just thinking in the longer term as this plays out, what are our expectations moving forward? It may well be infeasible to look at DSM as the only or the main resource as we move forward, especially considering that it can extend the reliance on the combustion of gas as a heating source. And so trying to understand how we get through the long term with what vision we have, and, to the extent we're using this plan to learn for the future, is a very small electrification pilot really the most acceptable way for Black Hills to kind of learn about the tools available as we continue down the journey of deeper greenhouse gas reduction. So those are some of the things I think would be helpful for us to better understand. I don't know, as we look, does that look like some tweaks or modifications to the settlement agreement to ensure we address these concerns or what? But that's what I'd be looking to discuss with you next week and with advisors and counsel in the interim.
Well, I appreciate your thoughtful, nuanced response to the settlement agreement, and support taking a week to look at each of those issues and bringing it back next week. And, I'd just say more broadly, I share the affordability concerns and, also the concerns about having a gas-only utility, spend this amount of money when it clearly has potentially perverse incentives. So I appreciate your thoughtfulness in trying to steer a path forward to improve the settlement agreement. But not raise those other concerns. But really curious to hear where you're coming from, Commissioner Plant.
Yeah, I had some similar concerns and hadn't thought of a couple of those things, which I appreciate your insights on. I mean, I'd be satisfied in limiting the DSM to weatherization efforts. I think that would help both in electrification and in if people continue with gas heat, and would avoid some of those issues that you mentioned. I will say, I sympathize with the sweep argument here around, we have a clean heat plan that ostensibly has a target of 22% reductions in 2030, and here we have a plan that actually leads to increased emissions in 2030 based on the baseline. And so it seems a little bit a little counterintuitive to have these additional funds go towards achieving a target that it actually goes in the opposite direction. I have to say, though, that I have absolutely no confidence that if Black Hills was running a beneficial electrification program, they would run it effectively or even attempt to run it effectively. I think if we're going to do this kind of thing, which, it may be reasonable to do, then we should be looking at third-party implementation for these things that go, directly counter to a business model that the utility has. I thought it was kind of crazy that they called this forced electrification. I have yet to see anybody be forced into electrification. But I think we are limited both in a realistic assumption that they're going to achieve any beneficial electrification if a gas company is running an electrification program. I don't think it's going to happen. And I think if we're going to do that kind of thing, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't do that, but if we're going to do that, we're going to need to have a third-party implementer. And I think that we'd probably see, much more successful implementation of DSM measures at the same time, if we were to do that. So, and then I also share your thoughts around the thermal networks. And I think this is an area where the gas company can develop a viable business model, and would like to see a little bit more aggressive effort towards developing that model from the company, and would look forward to looking at what additional opportunities are there as we consider this over the next week.
So I think we're prepared to put this off to next week. Anything else you'd like to add, Commissioner Gilman?
No, I think that's all helpful context. I'll try and work with Mr. Mendelson, Ms. Dundas in the interim to see, what this looks like if we try to address some of these concerns as a potential proposal for next week.
So we'll take this up again next week, Mr. Mendelson.
Sure, and we can flesh out some of these concepts. I would like to caution the Commission because concepts like a third-party implementer were far afield from anything on the record here in this case, and probably some other items. So
I don't think Commissioner Plant was suggesting we order that here. I think he was.
I don't think we can order that.
I think he was just pointing out that if you were going to massively expand the budget, there was this conflicting incentive, and those type of budgets would only be supported by different implementation models. But I don't want to speak for you.
No, that's accurate. And if we were to pursue something like that in the future, or we were to ask people to bring forward proposals for that kind of thing, that's not something that I would be opposed to.
Or might support. All right, so we'll, I don't know, do we need a written decision? We'll just bring this back next week, right?
I think we could just bring it back and prepare materials for your deliberations and get to more specific, concrete decision points.
Cool. All right. Proceeding number 24AL-0275E. Ms. Dundas.
Good morning, Commissioners. In this proceeding, which is the Black Hills rate case, SOPs are due on Friday. We anxiously await those SOPs. We got a motion from Black Hills yesterday requesting a page limit of 60 pages for its SOP. Black Hills states the motion's unopposed as long as the 60-page limit applies to all parties. So for your decision today is the limited decision point as to whether to allow Black Hills to file a 60-page SOP and extend that opportunity to all parties.
Commissioner Gilman.
Reluctantly, yes. I beg everyone to not all submit 60 pages. Brevity is your friend. But we'll try and read them.
The old Mark Twain quote, sorry, I didn't have time to write a shorter letter. Yeah, so hopefully that's not what's going on here. Commissioner Plant.
Yeah, as I recall, we had set it at 50, so they just couldn't get it squeezed in there. Yeah, sure.
I'm fine with that too, reluctantly. And that can be an ABC decision granting the motion and waiving response time.
Thank you, Commissioners.
Commissioner Gilman, any final thoughts before we adjourn?
Nothing additional.
Commissioner Plant?
Nope, good to see everybody in person.
Happy New Year, and we're adjourned.